waters with 6 races living together.
Globespan is a Guyanese dialogue moving towards the realization of one nation in one Guyana. It's a platform that offers an all-inclusive discussion, with the pros, the cons, the ones that is taken aside, and the ones that stand in the middle. Globespan believes agreeing and disagreeing are part of the nation's building. Globespan believes that every Guyanese voice is part of the nation's building. As we span the globe for voices from the diasporas and those living home, we stand on our commitment that we are all Guyanese working towards one nation in one Guyana.
Coffee and Dr. Jagan, Bobby, she gave us our great sons. Rohan Kanhai, Coffee and Dr. Jagan.
As the world turns on its axis bringing changes, we as Guyanese must adopt to those changes for a better Guyana for all. Globespan stands on its axis with its belief that one nation, one Guyana, one destiny must include voices from all corners of Guyana.
Me Guyana, land of many waters with 6 races living together.
Okay, so welcome to another issue of Globespan24x7, owned and operated by Mr. Nohar Singh. Joining us tonight, as usual, as our technical operator, Mr. Devin Bissoon. We are discussing tonight nationality and identity in Guyana. With us tonight are 4 very distinguished personalities, no stranger to us. We have Professor Nehusi, Professor Betram Ramarat, Mr. Vincent Alexander, and Mr. Ravindra Dev. Gentlemen, welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight. Viewers, listeners, thank you for joining us. Let's get straight into the topic. Ms. Nehusi, I'll put you on the spot. Would you like to define for us our topic for tonight, identity and nationality in Guyana? You know, as everyone has multiple identities, so if you could just define the term for us, what we mean by identity and nationality.
All right, thank you very much, Kayan, sir, and fellow panelists. Thank you and all the rest of that. Hello to all our listeners and viewers. I think that before I define the topic, it's important to say that this is an extremely important topic for all of us. And I hope that that will come out in our discussion tonight. Identity, you did say that there are multiple identities, and that's correct. But the kind of identity I want to talk about is the one that gives us a general orientation in life. And that is basically who you are in the sense of what your history is, how you understand that history, and your culture, how you understand and practice that culture. Because these are the things that locate you in place and time, that orient you, that tells you where your people have been, where you are now, where you need to go, tells you what's right and what's wrong. So that's identity. Nationality is the sense and the fact of belonging to a nation. We're all Guyanese, and therefore there are certain things that we have in common, including rights and responsibilities that arise from belonging to the nation called Guyana. We have been in search of national identity, and this further complicates the matter, I hope, for a while. And all of these are things that we should spend time trying to unravel, discuss, understand, see where we need to make adjustments. So I hope that I've given it some broad strokes and that we could begin a discussion immediately after one other thing I want to say. And this is the sense of where we're coming from in terms of identity. I think that one of the things that interferes with our identity, and this is especially for African Guyanese, is what transpired long ago with us, where our identity was assassinated. Colonialism, beginning with enslavement, attempted to teach us that the best person, God, was the white male, and that the extent to which you differed from the white male was the extent to which you were inferior or less than the white male. So things like sexism is involved. Women were inferior to the white male patriarchal society. Then there are things like color and race and so on. And we were taught that to be different, especially to be different from white people, was to be inferior. Our African Guyanese lost out most because our history, most of us don't know. We've been taught to demean our culture. I'm still struggling with many of these things today. And for all of us, we need to understand that to be different is not necessarily to be either inferior or superior. We just different, there are differences in human beings. So I want to leave it there. I hope I've raised enough questions for us to have a good discussion. Thank you.
Let's have a commentary from our other professor, Bitram Ramrad.
Good evening, gentlemen and ladies and panelists. Just a couple of quick points. You know, I've taught for many years a class on human geography. In terms of topics, when we talk about the state and ethnicity and nationality and so on, this has been one of the more challenging, you know, part of the course, so to speak. But as Kimani said, you know, when you think of identity, to kind of make this in simple terms, you know, one of the questions I guess you can ask yourself is, who am I? Right? That defines yourself. Most people refer to this as cultural identity, which includes all of those, the values, your religious ideas, the kind of clothing you wear, your language, your history, and so on, right? So in my head, that's what identity or cultural identity implies. So there's a cultural element, and of course, identity change over the years, right? Whether it's living under the Europeans, for many years, you've kind of adopted some of those values along the way. And when we think of nationality, I think the best way to kind of define that is to ask the question, where do I live? So people tend to equate nationality, you know, with citizenship, right? Which comes with basic rights and so on. That's a general definition, right? In terms of what we mean by those two terms. Now, we can talk about the fact that cultural identity does change, and so does nationality. If we accept those two definitions, you can be a citizen of one country or another country. Or in the case of Jewish folks, you can be a citizen of the United States, or you can be a citizen of Israel if you're Jewish. I believe that's how that works. But you know, cultural identity is significant, especially in societies that are made up of different cultural groups. Now, when you look at a country like Japan or China, North Korea, South Korea, Denmark, all of those places where you have a single dominant ethnic group, it's not so much of a challenge to establish, you know, some kind of framework of governance. But the last point I do want to make, you know, if we're going to take this and kind of apply this to Guyana, Kimani talked about, you know, the fact that cultural values were eroded along the way, right? Especially for African Guyanese. Indians, on the other hand, have retained much of their cultural values. A lot of it, I don't know how you can measure that, but obviously India, for instance, you know, was the Matri-Bhumi. That's the motherland for a lot of Hindus, right? And in the 1930s in Guyana, the independence movement, whatever was happening in India, was significant for Indians, whether they were living in Fiji or Guyana and so on. So the point I'm trying to make about that is that the fact that Indians have retained much of their cultural values has been a source of discontent, because when you look at literature that has been written, whether it's by people like Edgar Mittelholzer or other folks who have analyzed Guyanese society, one of the things that always seems to rear its head is that the question that is being posed to Indians, well, why are you so oriented, towards India, for instance? Why do you have to maintain that culture? So in a sense, it is being used to make the argument that you're probably not very patriotic to the country you're living in, Guyana. So that is the ironic offshoot of that, coming from people who have, in a sense, lost much of the cultural values, looking at those who have maintained it as a source of contention. So the argument has been made that, well, maybe the Indians are not very patriotic, right? They're not loyal to Guyana. So I will leave it at that, and I guess we can round robin, and we'll come back to some other points I want to make.
A former academic, Vincent Alexander.
When I think of identity, I'm really thinking about the individual and the attributes which one can use to identify that individual from the perspective of one's ancestry, from the perspective of one's culture, which includes one's language. I mean, include here also from the perspective of one's ethnicity, which is not unrelated to one's ancestry. So someone is identified by those attributes which inhere in his or her being, which is quite different from nationality. And truthfully speaking, I would prefer to use the terminology citizenship as opposed to nationality, and I will probably develop that point as we go through the program. But citizenship here means an association with a particular geographical space where one exists, association with a particular state, so to speak, that is geographically defined, and which, because of place of birth or because of heritage, one has certain rights and obligations in relation to how one exists in that space, how one exercises one's citizenship. And as I said, I'm differentiating here a bit citizenship from nationality. Very often it is conflated with nationality insofar as that space in which you reside has a name, and you are considered a citizen of that place, and therefore they tend to attribute your nationality to the name of that place. So in that regard, the term nationality probably can be used, but I would really prefer to use the term citizenship as we discuss identity on one hand and citizenship slash nationality on the other hand.
Ravi, you want to summarize, give clarity, further clarification on any of the preceding comments?
Mr. Dev, you're on mute.
Abby, you're muted. We're not hearing you.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. Since our moderator has pigeonholed my fellow panelists, let me say, well, I will come from a different silo, my other hat as a legal person from the legal profession, to talk about these two terms of identity and nationalism. And much of the present confusion, and there is confusion, is really semantic. But as with most semantic, it goes back to who does the naming, who has, and that then brings the question, who has the power to do the naming? And we come back to what Kimani had introduced, the whole notion of the colonial state. You see, we got to, every time we begin to talk about our issues in Guyana, we got to bring back the fact that we are the result of a colonial imposition. And there was life before those colonials in every sense of the word. So from a legal standpoint, before the European conquered the rest of the world, when they after they introduced the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, before that, when you were living in a particular place for millions of years, you were living in a place. So let's just take the Ottoman Empire, for instance, that predates that, 1646. The Ottoman Empire, you had a multiplicity of nationalities living there. In fact, in the modern world, all those nationalities were seen as explosive, but yet for 400 years, the Serbs and the Bosnians and the Albanians and the Greeks and everybody were living there. And it wasn't explosive. So something happened after World War I when the Ottoman Empire collapsed. And that is colonialism. And we're seeing part of it exploding right now in Gaza and Israel there. And what is that? Before the European colonials imposed themselves on us, there was a notion of jus sanguinis, your right to belong by blood, sanguinis, right? Meaning your inheritance, what we would call our culture. So you would be, therefore, you would be a Serb, you were an Albanian, you were Hindu, whatever way you want, from that whole standpoint of culture, in seeing yourself where you are rooted, it was okay. However, after the Treaty of Westphalia, the Europeans insisted on now forming a rule that is called jus soli, that whoever the king was of a particular territory, you had to adopt that religion. The religion of the king or the culture of the king became the religion of the people. You understand? And that is where the confusion still remains with us. That somehow when we think and we talk, and that's why I know where Vincent is coming from, to distinguish between the two terms. Some people talk of civic nationalism, to genuflect to the word nationalism, to say, okay, we formed a state of citizenship, as Vincent said. So there's that aspect that comes out of one's citizenship. And then, of course, there's the other part, the cultural citizenship, which now we insist must be conflated, and which we don't have to. It's just, and this is where I want to leave it, it's just that the rulers impose their culture, their particular culture, which was short-sighted, which was brutal, which was ignorant, which was everything negative on peoples like from Africa who had a notion of Ubuntu, in which one was defined by one's projection from others. So identity in Africa or in India was never a question of what you define yourself in some kind of solitude, because no one can be defined in solitude. You understand? In our thing, even the gods, by my belief system, define themselves vis-a-vis others. and therefore you are formed by the others. And this is where we come in, that in reality, I want to stop at this point, that the colonials then defined us vis-a-vis themselves as the norm, as the standard. And therefore, by definition, from the very beginning, as I said, and I keep on saying, by this great chain of being, where God, a white fellow with a gray beard, sits on high, around him with his white angels. Then below them, of course, comes the white man. Jesus was born as a white man, contrary to all evidence. And then we come, of course, to others who are then gradated. And by their definition, and this is what we have to come to again and again and again. It's not a matter of the Indians looking down as blacks. Definitionally, in the beginning, when they enslaved Africans, dragged them across the Atlantic and dumped them into this so-called New World, to enslave them, persuaded not only those of themselves that these Africans were inferior and being black was inferior, that basically that it was now embedded in your skin for the first time in history, something that you can't rub out. You understand? So even as an Indian now, people would tell me as I grew up as a boy, you know, he nice, but he dark. You understand? Because me and Vincent got the same color. I know Vincent. I don't know you, Kimani. I never touched skin with you. I know Vincent and me got the same color. You look like a fair-skinned fellow there, Kimani. I don't know about you, boy.
I don't use that.
Yeah. So to come back, I want to stop there and throw it back at the panel. So I'm in agreement, but I'm trying to put what we have, I think my fellow panelists have discussed in a kind of a context from a legal standpoint, which we have to disentangle.
Yeah, I think that was a nice summary of the concept and the terms. Kimani, you agree?
Yes, and for me, we got to do something more than just define things. And that's why I found Betaram's point to be so valuable. You know, we got to see how this thing operated in Guyana and how it touched our lives. And Betaram is making an extremely important point. You know, Indian people kept their culture on the whole, despite attempts by missionaries to Christianize them. And many Guyanese, other races and cultures, find this to be something not very comfortable. And I'm proposing that the reason why many Guyanese find Indians holding on to their culture to be something uncomfortable is because we've been persuaded that we must get into this melting pot, supposedly melting pot, where all of us will try to become white in terms of values and attitudes and that kind of thing. And it's sheer nonsense. You could never, ever become somebody else. And if you accept that your culture is inferior, then you've been colonized in the most fundamental way. The way forward for us as different people living in Guyana is to recognize genuine differences. That's why I said to be different is neither to be inferior or superior. And all of us who have lost culture and history could learn something valuable from Indian people who have held on to their culture. And, you know, it works. I'm not saying that because you're an Indian, ipso facto, everything is hunky-dory and so on. I'm talking about generalities here. And I think that it's important for us as Guyanese to challenge ourselves and recognize what we could learn from each other. And I think that one thing everybody else could learn from Indian people is that you got to know who you are. I think Betaram said, you know, who are you? That's the most fundamental question. And if we cannot answer it, well, then we're confused. And if we're confused about who we are, everything else about us is at least suspect. You cannot not know who you are and know for certain what your interests are. And put that another way, if you don't know who you are, you're not going to know what your real, genuine interests are. And that's a fact. So I want to stop there and give other people a chance to come back at least.
Yeah, I think Professor is right. I mean, we all need to know who we are, but do we really know who we are in Guyana? And that, I think that's where we're heading with this topic. Do we really know who we are as a people in Guyana, regardless of quote unquote our ethnicity and our identity? Professor Ramharak?
Well, I think now that we have the definition out of the way, you know, one of the assumption is that when you look at the history of Indians, especially in Guyana, you could also include Suriname and Trinidad here, is that we were able to maintain, you know, that cultural system that we brought, right, from India and so on. But the problem that I see here, which is something that is not being written about on a wider scale, is that we do have a lot of forces that also work against maintaining, you know, that cultural connection. I mean, you can't call yourself an Indian without accepting the fact that India exists, and there is a place called India, and that is the place where our ancestors came from. Again, I'm speaking as an Indian here. But the point I'm trying to make here is that even within the Indian community, there have been forces that have been working against that. And I'll give you a couple of examples. You know, we in the 1950s, with the birth of the nationalist movement, you had a kind of thinking that says that you cannot belong to cultural groups because if you're trying to unite the working class, all Guyanese, then you have to kind of give up that cultural element, right, that defines you or that defines Indian organization that you may be a part of. So my point here is that we have seen a tradition where many of these Indian organizations that have contributed or would have contributed to maintaining a more vibrant Indian culture and strengthening that connection with India, because those organizations were weakened with that philosophy, you know, that was introduced in the 1950s. Because if you were seen as being, let's say, a member of the League of Colored People or the British Guyana East Indian Association, you know, you were seen as being parochial. So that, in a sense, would in the minds of the leaders who led the movement, would work against, you know, promoting a united working class. The other problem that I see is that many of the people who are in positions of power, to kind of extend that cultural link or to strengthen those cultural values among Indians. And I'm talking about, when I say people in power, I'm talking about politicians. And I'm also talking about, you know, our intellectual leaders. And I can tell you that many of the folks who have written about our own history, and again, I know I'm talking about the history of Indians, but I think it's important to make this point. So many of our political leaders or intellectuals have, in a sense, sort of shied away, you know, from addressing those cultural issues and so on. Again, it may be because of ideology. You know, Marxism has no place to include, you know, those primordial sentiments that people may share. So therefore, again, if you're trying to unite the working class, you have to shed those things. And I can tell you, in the Guyana experience, you know, we have a very long tradition since the 1950s of people in power who have, in a sense, worked against strengthening, you know, those people who may be involved in strengthening those cultural values. And I'll give you one last example. I cannot think of a single organization, and I'm talking about independent organization, that sees it very important to promote Indian cultural values, right, and to maintain that link. With India, many of our politicians today and many of our Indian intellectuals will, in a sense, condemn Modi and what's happening in India. Now, there may be some excesses there, yeah, but the point is, for the first time, we see an outreach from India to Indians who are living abroad, right? And this is the first time that India is trying to reclaim its sense of history after, years of being conquered by, by the Muslims and the British. So in a sense, that's a good thing, right? And I think all of that will, in a sense, strengthen the cultural values. But many of our intellectuals don't seem to see it that way, because you have to adopt these universalistic values, right? We have to be against the white man because they promoted colonialism. They don't want to focus on their own issues that they have to deal with to help to strengthen those cultural elements. I don't know if that seems like it's kind of far-fetched, but I can tell you in the 1960s, this was a discussion that was also taking place, especially among Indians. And again, I can cite some other examples to you where Indian organizations or people who would have been very cultured, deeply ingrained in the Indian, in understanding Indian history and our cultural values and so on, were pushed aside, right? Whether it was done politically to erode them, or whether it was done because they were seen as racist, right? That seems to be a terminology that is being used to silence people. So yes, we've maintained our cultural values. We've kept a lot of it. But there have been changes, but we've also have to struggle internally, right? To, in a sense, kind of preserve whatever cultural values that we've had and that we have maintained over the years.
I think I'm in agreement with that. I mean, there have been a lot of issues of people who try to assert their identity and face a pushback from others within the same group. Wouldn't you agree, Vincent? And what's your take of what Professor Ramrak said?
We live in a society which may be described as a plural society. That it is a society suggests some oneness. And that oneness has to do with the rights and obligations that are common to us in that place where the society exists. And society is naturally associated with a particular geographical place. And so there's that oneness that has to do with our being a part of the community of that place and the way in which, as elements, as persons, we relate to each other. And this really is talking about, in some regards, our interrelationships, which are largely legal, and also provides for us as that one body to be juxtaposed to other societies where people live in other places and where they have their peculiar regimes of relationship that is legally based. And so between societies, you find that you have groups with commonalities interacting with each group having its own internal interaction that defines the oneness of that group. But we don't simply live in society, we live in a plural society. And so that suggests that though there is this oneness about us, there is also some plurality. And that plurality is associated with our identity, which is derived from our culture, a culture which embodies our heritage, a culture which embodies our belief system, a culture which may embody our language, and that these things which are associated with our culture are in some regards innate, in the sense that you don't decide that you want to be that. You're born into it by virtue of heritage and ancestry and all that's associated with that heritage and that ancestry, which is different to being a citizen. You could be or not be. There's some level of artificial existence in terms of a citizen, because you can adopt it, you can give it up. It is something ascribed to you, as opposed to identity which inherently prescribes who you are. So I think we have to look at it in the context of juxtaposing that body of people who, by virtue of where they are physically located and how they relate to each other based on largely a legal regime and probably other norms and conventions which are not legal, but which are largely man-made, largely consciously man-made, or evolve over time, as opposed to the individuals who, by virtue of their history, heritage, their culture, their language, their belief, their value systems, etc., can be seen to be subsets of that society. Hence, the plurality of the society. On one hand, there is a oneness. On the other hand, there is diversity, because one could clearly identify groups by virtue of certain attributes, separate and apart from their larger identification in that common place, in that common thing called society.
Yeah, okay. So Ravi, oneness and diversity both exist within the same human being, within the same person, in every society.
Well, there's a danger, I think, among my fellow panelists in looking at this issue ahistorically. One doesn't have to be a Marxist like my friend, Mr. Alexander, to accept the nature, the need to look at things historically. Historically, all things change. One can go back to Zeno. You can never put your toe into the same river twice. What I want to point out, though, is that when we use these terms like African and Indian, it appears that we are making some kind of ontological assumption that there's something there called African or Indian. And, you know, there's a school of thought that talk about these primordial cultural elements into which we are somehow fixed and we can't get out of. And modern research has shown that while there are certain cultural tendencies that will be passed down, it is always contextual, and that's what I want us to grasp with. That, for example, let's start with our African brothers who were dragged across the Atlantic. They were taken from all of the tribes of West Africa, not just one tribe. They were taken from all of the tribes of West Africa. Therefore, they brought at least a dozen cultures with them into the Caribbean when they were brought here. But eventually, we now talk about them as being African, even after the abolition of slavery. As I keep on reminding everyone, after 1838, 13,355 so-called liberated Africans were brought as indentured servants and were scattered across Guyana into almost all parts, especially my part of the country, West Bank, Baggotsville, and those villages near there. So the point is that they brought their culture. We hear of the Kru, we heard of the Congo, and they brought these because they were more like Central Africa than the West Africa, out of the Bight of Benin and the and up north there. So the point I want to make is that when we use the term African, we have to accept that there was a process of melding them, and therefore we have to always accept that what we see as a given, we must not accept as a given. It has happened once before, that they were melded by whatever process, and we can get into that, and we can use words like whips and chains and all of that. But it means if something is done, it can be undone by other processes, meaning it's a historical process. And similarly to what Beto has posited, which I would disagree to a large extent, we were brought out of, 86% of us were brought out of North India. And 14% was brought out of South India. We call them Madrasis, people like Moses Nagamutu and others who would complain that they were perfilized within that North Indian mix. But even within the North Indian mix, for example, my great-great-grandmother came out of Calcutta. They came out of Calcutta. I had Bisram, who was in Calcutta just 2 weeks ago. I had him check out the people out of which they came from in a place called Bankura. So the point is, but her husband, when she got married, came out of Bihar, a totally different culture. If you want to talk about culture, totally. The the Bengalis worship the mother as Kali, which was this big festival we had. The Bhojpuris worship Sri Ram. I am a Ram Bhakta. I worship Sri Ram. So the point is, though, that they melded. And what caused that melding? Just like with the Africans, a particular process caused that melding, even after emancipation, so-called emancipation. Similarly, the Indians went through that processing. Different people have looked at it from different angles. So we can talk of the plantation, but that just, hides a lot of sins. What happened on the plantation? As I've mentioned before, I'm in the process of doing a history of my village of Iflat, going back to 1766, when it was founded, to today. And what we see in historical times, that the same Indians that we see as monolithic, that on the estate, they were kept there, and they were slowly, though, forced to change. For a simple thing like they were only given off Sunday as a holiday. So even though we might feel that, they were given a space to make a mandir, and there was a mandir on the lodges, but that you could only go there on Sundays, which is a Christian notion of a particular day. Therefore, you can only go there. So let's look at that one institution, how it was changed. So you go on Sundays, you now have congregational worship, which is totally anti-Hindu, because Hindu sees each person in communion with their own God. At that time, it was said there was 300 million Indians, there was 300 million gods, because your concept of God is what you pray to. But yet we now took a Christian notion of all praying. We now had the Pandit who suddenly was transformed from a Purohit who simply did your worship, your puja, he now started preaching. Never happened in India. Nobody gives a sermon like a priest. And if you go today, you ought to hear the intonations of these guys. You know, yes, Lord. You know, and you keep on haranguing people like that. So I want to close here. I want us to look at historically at what we are calling Indians and Africans. I want us to be concrete and let us use examples to illustrate the points we are making. So my contention is that as we go forward, I'll leave it as this, is that we are looking, as I have always said, at least I'm looking for us Guyanese to create one national narrative, a narrative that encompasses all of us, but gives us the space to now disentangle ourselves from the web of what we call coloniality, which is colonialism still existing. Enough said.
I think Professor Nehusi would agree with you. We're still coloniality, Professor.
Yes, I agree. I'm very pleased with what I've been hearing, and I want to edge us to look at the negatives, the limitations on our condition, because if we don't do that, we might be saying things or implying things that are not necessarily true. But I'm going to leave the negatives there. I'm going to ask about the caste system in India and how that may have impacted upon us. But I want to go in another direction and visit some things that were said before. And Betaram, you've got my attention tonight. I don't know why, but you know, what you're saying keeps resonating with me. Don't get jealous, Ravi and Vincent.
You professors stick together. Me and Vincent will have to have a chat about this.
All right, man, if you think so. Anyway, the whole question of Marxism and how it functioned in Guyana is a very, very important one. And the brand or the interpretation of Marxism that was popularized, imposed in Guyana in the 50s, the dominant notion did not recognize cultural differences. The dominant notion was a single working class. Now, that's not our reality. And that is a notion that was taken from Europe at a point in time when that kind of difference wasn't politicized and very apparent in Europe. But in Guyana, people like Ayusi Kwayana, Martin Carter, and others were saying, let's talk to the people. Let us go and do work among the Indians and Africans and other people to teach them about each other, to promote solidarity. But the principal leaders of the national movement wanted power, political power. And that critical work, which is what in a way we're discussing here tonight, that critical work of understanding yourself and the other was not done. And it's still outstanding in Guyana today. And that's one of the sources of our problems. Because there are a whole lot of misunderstandings. There's a whole lot of grouses, you know. There's a whole lot of not taking the other into consideration when we're making decisions. And unless Guyanese recognize that it's neither inferior nor superior to be different, and that there is a valuable lesson we could teach ourselves and other people, that people of different races and cultures could live together, could learn from each other, could strengthen themselves and each other by this kind of approach to life, we are not going to make the best of ourselves. That's one thing. I don't think that the practice of Marxism has always been one in which cultural difference is subsumed. And I have in mind China, where a lot of effort has been spent to promote the culture of autonomous people, people who are not in the numerical majority, people who are in the numerical minority. They talk about developing culture. This is helping people to understand and display their own culture. And I think this is part of the strength of China today, because they don't necessarily impose themselves upon everybody else. I'm not saying that there haven't been instances of disappointment and disagreement over the question of, invading somebody else's space, cultural space, and that kind of thing. These are negotiations we'll have to do. So for me, these are some of the most important things we could take from our lives as people attempting to live in Guyana. And I just want to restate this. You could change your nationality, but the moment you impair or attempt to change your identity, you're in serious, serious, serious trouble. I'll leave it there.
Well, thank you very much. Before I call on the other panelists to respond or make further contributions, we have a young man on who's joining us. He's seeking a city council seat, and the elections are currently on early voting. The election is on November 7th. I'd like to give him a few minutes, ask him a few questions. We have young Rusat Ramgopal, a Guyanese, seeking office in the Richmond Hill area. Rusat, you want to tell us why you're running for office and the state of the campaign and how people can vote? You're muted.
Is it possible we can see him upright?
Yeah.
All right. Yes. Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes. Yeah. But we are seeing you sideways, so I don't know why.
I hope there's no symbolism in that.
No. But on the Globespan, it's showing I'm upright on the Globespan. Yeah. So I think it's just because I'm joining in on the campaign trail. But yeah,
go ahead.
It's going good on the Globespan show. But thank you very much, Dr. Bisram. It's an honor to be interviewed by you. Previously, when I appear on Globespan, normally I'm the one in the interview seat. But if I'm going to be interviewed by someone, it's an honor to be interviewed by someone as prominent as Dr. Vishnu Bisram. And it's great to recognize some of the panelists like Mr. Ravi Dev. I've looked up to a lot of these guys for many years growing up. So yes, my name is Rusat Ramgopal. Many would have known me watching Globespan over the years. I've often been on in some capacity, but right now, yes, I'm running for City Council in District 28. District 28 is where a lot of Guyanese Americans live in New York. It's the South Ozone Park area, 100th Street to Guy Brewer, Liberty Avenue to the Belt Parkway. This is actually the only City Council district in all of New York City that has Guyanese as the largest ethnic group. So this is the heart of Little Guyana. But unfortunately, over the years, the Guyanese community just doesn't turn out to vote, or they're not united. And we've never had a Guyanese American candidate win office at the city council level or state assembly level or state senate level or congressional level. So this Guyanese community has never been properly represented in the legislative capacity. That's something that we're trying to change this year. So we're running for the city council seat, District 28. This is the off-year election, 2023. Voter turnout is very low overall across the city, but sadly it's even lower among our area. So right now across the city, only about 8,000 people voted in Queens in the early voting so far. But in the South Ozone Park area, only about 100 people have voted. So even in a low turnout year, it's still very, very low amongst our community. And all I'd say is don't complain if you don't vote. You can't complain after the fact if you don't vote now. And everyone in our community always has something to complain about. This is not getting done. That's not getting done for the area. But you have to come out and vote and get somebody in there to do these things. Look, people, they go vote for president, governor, but city council is the body that affects your everyday life here. the local issues affecting the city, sanitation, roads, public safety. The city council is the one who defunded the police. That's why you have a crime crisis. The education in New York is doing very poorly right now. Half the kids can't do reading or math at grade level. So with all these issues, you have to come out and vote for the local elections like city council. And unfortunately, I think many of your panelists would agree, the Guyanese who live in Queens, New York are more concerned about local government elections in Guyana than local government elections right here in Queens.
Quite true, yes. Yeah. And where can they vote? First of all, city council races are across the city. All 51 seats are up for grabs. It's a 2-year term. There'll be election again in 2025, I think it is.
Yes.
And where can they vote?
So the early voting for South Ocean Park residents is currently going on at Resorts World Casino. But for the Guyanese who may live in other areas across the Van Wyck, etc., there's also early voting going on at York College. But the two main areas that the listeners of this program are probably early voting at: Resorts World Casino if you live in the South Ocean Park area, and potentially if you live across the Van Wyck, closer to the Jamaica area, you'd be at York College.
And if you're living in Brooklyn and Staten Island, you have to check to see where you could vote early. But the actual date for election is November 7th, and I think polls up at 6 and closes at 8:30 or 9.
It closes at 9 on the election day. So the regular election day, November 7th, is voting at your local schools, and the early voting is going on right now at Resorts World Casino. Early voting normally ends at 5 p.m. It's even open on Saturday and Sundays, or 9 to 5. But tonight and tomorrow night, it's open until 8 p.m. So, for those, you have a lot of Guyanese like, "Minay will vote, I gotta go work, this, that, whatever." You have until 8 p.m. tomorrow night. It's open for early voting then. You also have the weekend, and you also have election day itself, November 7th.
Thank you. Thank you for that information. Anything else you'd like to say?
Just once again, thank you for the opportunity. Thank you to Mr. Nohar Singh and Devin for the opportunity to be on Globespan. Thank you once again to Dr. Vishnu Bisram. And again, I hope our listeners come out and vote. It's too important to complain after the fact. Don't complain November 8th if you didn't go out and vote November 7th.
Yeah. Well, thank you again for appearing on our program. Regrettably, we were seeing you sideways. I hope somehow it can be adjusted for us to see you real. Thank you again, and good night.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Bisram.
Right.
Take care.
So, gentlemen, let's resume our program. I think I was going to ask Professor Betram Ramran to respond to Professor Kimani Nehusi.
No, I think I should let Vincent know that, speaking sideways like that is a strategy to gain votes. Well, good luck to the young man. He seems very articulate, and he knows what he's doing. Just a couple of quick points, and and as I always try, I hope I'm not a spoiler, but what I like to do when we have these kinds of discussion is to kind of bring it back, to the ordinary folks at home, and apply our ideas there. So a couple of quick things. I think it's important for us to understand. I think Ravi made this point that when we talk about Africans and Indians or the Amerindians, as ethnic communities or cultural communities, they're not all united as a group, right? But it's also important to understand, that our group identity, because we live in a plural society, is also influenced and can be shaped, by the other existing group that we live, and interact with in this marketplace that we call Guyana, right? So those things, have to be kept in mind. In terms of, how do we move from A to B to level C and try to get everyone to think in terms of this whole oneness? I don't see a conflict. I mean, there's that famous phrase, unity in diversity. I don't see a conflict in calling ourselves, Guyanese. That's our nationality. But at the same time, we can maintain our cultural values and cultural links. And I've pointed out the problem that I see, that is connected to the Indian community. Guyana is unique. I don't know if it's an aberration, but when you look at Guyanese society from the 50s and so on, you have had 3 major organizations, all of them Marxist oriented, right? But in terms of Marxist ideology, even within that ideology, there were also distinctions that had to be made. For instance, the Marxism that was practiced or envisioned by the PPP was more, in a sense, more aligned and connected with Soviet communism. And in a sense, I think to a large extent, you can make the argument, looking at the PPP and looking at the Jagans and what they have done, that they were more concerned, not necessarily about articulating that Indian concern. In fact, I've written something about this, about how, there was, to a certain extent, a sort of a marginalization of that Indian cultural value from the perspective of the PPP. And I've gotten some serious backlash from people like Clement Rohi, and Donald Ramatar. Keep in mind, these are not individuals who have a strong history of speaking out on behalf of Indians. Now, Chetty was a great person. He was one of a kind. You'll never have someone like him again. But if you look at Chetty's philosophy, and you compare that to, let's say, Walter Rodney or UC Guyana, right, or Ande, you see a distinction here in terms of an understanding of Marxism. And the distinction here, and this is important for us to understand, especially where the WPA is concerned, is that when you look at the mind of Walter Rodney and the things he has written about, you look at the work of UC Guyana, there is a strong understanding, a very strong understanding of who they were as Africans. And I think to a large extent, we can agree that yes, Africans have lost a lot of their cultural values, but in terms of the unanimity of thinking, of understanding who they are as Africans, I think they are far more advanced in that perspective. Give you a simple example. If you were to ask Walter Rodney how he would define himself, for him, nationality and cultural identity is very complex. He would most likely say, I am an African, right? I am a Guyanese, I am a person from the Caribbean, among other things. So he sees that cultural and that global link. We don't have that. So when Kimani talks about, yes, there was an attempt to go out there and work among the people, the assumption is being made that yes, people understand who they were when they were going out into the community. But that distinction, even in the ideological perspective, was different. So you don't have that there. So the WPA, in a sense, emerged as an organization that was very embedded in the African culture in the 1970s, right? And again, this was not something you can attribute to the PPP, right? In the 1970s, there were a lot of radical blacks from Africa, from the United States, who were invited by Guyana and Forbes into Guyana, right? And some of these folks would have argued that Chetty was a racist. And we know that, I mean, it's very difficult to make that argument. But my simple point is that you don't have that. And here's my evidence. You can have a person like Mr. Phillips, for instance, right, or the commissioner of police, talk about being proud as being an African. Where do we see those Indians who will be willing to make those kinds of statements and feel comfortable making those statements, right? So Walter was very deeply embedded in his culture. He understood that, but he was a Marxist, right? To me, that's an extension, a much more complex understanding of who he was, compared to the very rigid ideological perspective that you had with the PPP, right? Now, there are some distinctions here again, and I've made this point before, that when you look at people like Janet Jagan, we talk about white people. Here was a white Jewish woman, blonde hair, coming to Guyana. Indians turned her into a blue-eyed Bauji. But Janet, in an interview she made with David Debedin, was very concerned about her Jewish tradition, her Jewish background, right? She was very proud to tell David Debedin that me and Chetty, that is Janet and Chetty, were one of the first two people to go to Israel. Again, That's, that's her root. That's the Jewish tradition. When the violence broke out in 1999, following the election, 1998, one of the questions she asked David Debinin was, were they talking about, were they attacking me as a white person? So she was concerned about her Jewish background and her whiteness. Again, my simple point is that if you are making the argument that folks in the WPA or any other organization did not do a complete and a wholesome job, and they were not successful in terms of going out, right, to bring those communities together to create that oneness, that one Guyana, you're making an assumption that the leaders of these organizations understood that they come from different cultural groups in Guyana. And I think that was a problem. That was problematic for the WPA, because I don't know who in the WPA, right? I mentioned Andy, Rodney, right? Guyana and so on. But who in the WPA would have had that understanding and at the same time be a Marxist? So my argument is that if you had that level of understanding among the leadership, it would have probably been more successful for those folks to go out and promote that ideology and bring people together.
Vincent, your response?
I want to go back to where Ravi was at. When he sought, and correctly, to indicate that the African Guyanese were not a monolithic group, nor was the Indo Guyanese a monolithic group. And he's saying that in response, in some regards, to my plurality, which seems to suggest we have African Guyanese and we have Indo Guyanese. But I think that one has to contextualize how we arrive at that conglomeration of Indo Guyanese and African Guyanese. So whereas in fact it is true that it didn't come here as one group, that in the environment into which they came, and given the circumstances to which they were exposed, and given some superficial commonalities, so to speak, and the fact that they originated from the same place, then it facilitated that seeing them as Indians and seeing them as Africans. So I think the circumstance of their being is what led to that oneness among them that we seem to talk about, given the fact that they have come from different ethnic groups in Africa and in India. So one has to look at the peculiarity of the circumstance in which the interaction was taking place in Guyana that caused people in some regards to look inward and therefore to become insulated into a group as if they were a monolithic group, when historically, really it was a conglomeration, but a conglomeration which circumstances facilitated. But I think the important point being made here is that whilst we're talking about, on one hand, we're talking about identity, on the other hand, we're talking about nationality, we have to accept that I have contended that one process is artificial, kind of man-made, that is the societal aspect, whereas the other process is natural. That natural process, both from a historical perspective and from an evolutionary perspective, could in fact lead to growth, development, evolution, and I dare say probably even over time to transformation. But I want to emphasize it's a natural process. It's not a man-made, it's not an engineered process. It's a natural process facilitated by mixing and intermingling and things like that, and creating a fusion that can in fact lead to the evolution of an identity that embraces those who may have had different identities. Of course, this is a process over time, but certainly in the context of people mixing in more than one way, even biologically, you can have an evolution of a quote-unquote new entity built on the separate identities that are now fused to create something that is different. Of course, that will never interfere with the fact that even as you describe this new thing, you have to look back to the history of the parts in determining and in identifying the new whole, so that one does not necessarily throw away heritage, but culture could evolve. And here I don't want to speak to the colonial system of acculturation, where one culture imposes itself upon another, and therefore seek to submerge the identity of another. But that through the natural organic process, the emergence of something new. And I'm going to use a term which is very often used negatively, and that is this whole question of creolization, where different people finding themselves in the same space and intermingling over time can find that there is cross-fertilization that can take place. Not because they set out to cross-fertilize, but it's natural human existence. That cross-fertilization takes place. And you may well have something new emerging, which can lead to an identity that is not exactly the same that there was originally, and an identity that represents a fusion of identities and the emergence of a new identity built on the fusion of identities. And that is a natural process that we have to recognize that can occur. Of course, there is sometimes conscious pushback against that natural process. But if there isn't that conscious pushback, I think that emergence can occur much faster. It is predicated on mixing that is in terms of not living in enclaves, but living in communities where sharing takes place, where mutuality occurs, and where in a natural process, fusion also occurs. So I want to put that on the table, because in societies like ours, in the same way in which, in some regards, we may now argue that to have had an African being as opposed to an Indian being represented some kind of fusion that was occasioned not by people saying they want to fuse, but by reality creating that we can see at another level in that spiral human development, that fusion taking place. And so in a sense, we're talking about, no longer talking about uh, about different groups in terms of ethnicity, but we're talking about a humanity that has a common beginning, and a humanity which over time may find convergence taking place as well, back into one humanity.
So, Ravi, Vincent talked about cross-fertilization, infusion. Academics tend to use the term miscegenation. What's your take on it?
I think more demagogues use miscegenation, but I'll pass that over. As usual, Vincent deals with matters at a very ethereal plane, so I'll try to bring it down to the concrete, as I always try to do, which is that to the credit of the African Guyanese and also the African Caribbean person coming out of the plantations and coming out as Africans, very early on, there was a recognition of about the problems of this question of identity. In hindsight, it is easy for us to look back and say, well, maybe they were misguided, but each people at each time in history will make their history based on what's around them. So we see a Pan-African conference, I think in 1900. In 1919, I think you had the first Pan-African Congress. And to me, the most pertinent for us, and this is where Africans from across the world, but interestingly led by individuals from the Caribbean. Sylvester was a Trinidadian. So, and we had our own, for 1945, which to me is the most important one in Manchester, the Pan-African Congress of Manchester. I think it was the 5th Pan-African Congress, where you had all of who will become the leaders of the Caribbean, right? You had men like Eric Williams, you had men like Arthur Lewis, you had men like Adams, you had all the leaders, and then from Africa, Kenyatta and Nkrumah, and all of who would be there. But more importantly, you had an individual at the level of, from Guyana, Boxon, I believe, Ras McConan. You had, of course, CLR James, all there crafting a vision for the African people in the Caribbean. And I want us to be very, very careful that that is what they spoke about. It was from Africa and the Caribbean, people in the Caribbean, their African descendants, who were meeting as a Pan-African Congress in 1945 in Manchester, would chart a program, because by that time the British had subjugated all of us, especially Africans, to say, well, we're doing it for your own good, and we're going to train you all. You have to be given tutelage. Well, the logic of being given tutelage is that one day I'm going to grow up and I'm ready now, baby. And in 45, these leaders were saying, because here is Eric Williams, out of all saints, Oxford, how Lewis, the same thing. So you couldn't, they had jumped through all the hoops that the British had set for them. Williams, of course, would write in his book as to how he was still denied a place to sit at the All Saints table. You have to eat at that table. But be as it may, they jumped through the hoops, and they expected now power will be transmitted. So you have, by 1945, a group of African leaders from Africa and the Caribbean who are making common cause about an African nation. Right? Ras McConan is from, he put up money, he had own restaurants and so on, and he was as important as anybody else who would put up the money to do that. Forbes Burnham would arrive in 45, and by that time the conference would have been held, and he didn't go up there, he was in London, but the group he joined, the League of Colored People with Mr. Moody as the head, Moody would be given, the League of Colored People would be given the task of disseminating the papers that were all presented. So Mr. Burnham would have the papers that were presented. He would have had access to those papers as to what this vision was for the Caribbean and in Africa, a joint vision. So when we fast forward now to the 1950s, we're not acting in a vacuum. Individuals had a clear, especially from the African Guyanese community, had a clear picture, not only from 45, but we got to go back now. Again, I want us to be very concrete because this is real history. When in 1919, right, the British Guyana East Indian Association, under the leadership of Lakou, right, and MacDoom, pushes that Guyana could become an Indian colony, just to make it palatable for the Indian government, which was run, of course, by white people in those days, for them to look at it, to say, okay, but what did that do in Guyana? Of course, the plan was thrown out in India by Gandhi. There never was immigration from India based on that plan. But in Guyana, it had a backlash because the people of African origin, as early as the beginning of the 20th century, already had a conception that we would inherit, after going through all of this, we would inherit Guyana. There was a notion already there, and if one reads the literature about having greater legitimacy, so you have the Negro Progress Convention formed. You had Critchlow forming a labor union, but he was an integral part of the Negro Progress Convention that laid out that they were representing African Guyanese and African Guyanese interests in Guyana. You had the Marcus Garvey's UNIA that formed branches in Guyana on all of that. So by the time you reach the 50s, there had been a whole discourse as to the implications of a plural society, what it meant, especially vis-a-vis power. And that is the thing we must not pussyfoot around. In Guyana, what was it that made the groups become groups? It was, by and large, this notion of taking it from the British because they ruled as an ethnic group, that our people were not stupid, or at least they then analogized that power then is to be taken by an ethnic group. And it makes sense for the ethnic group to coalesce and be united. And that was the message of the Negro Progress Convention, which did, with all due respect to what Vincent Alexander is doing today with Ipadaji and all that, did all of those things. Tried to launch a pharmacy, tried to launch a grocery, tried to launch a farm, send people up to Tuskegee up in the United States to learn agriculture, get 500 acres by Garden of Eden. And we must ask ourselves, why did those efforts fail? And in the present, when we are trying all of it, that we don't repeat those mistakes. What I want to say is two things that, let me summarize, is that let us become concrete rather than build new castles in the air, right? We are not going to go through the same thing. Let us find out what those pressures were. Identity we see in Guyana is formed more by pressures from outside. And there's a theorem in sociology that talks about the solidity of the group is directly proportional to the pressures on that group. So in my history of IFLAT, I see by the 1950s, when the Indians were moving out of the Lodges, the African Guyanese had moved to IFLAT front. They had that village by what we call Kashmir, near the road front, for 100 years. But when the Indians were moving in, and they were now moving into the factories where the Africans got gotten all of the prestige jobs, but they were starting to move in, that threat. So Mr. Burnham has been blamed for causing this split, and I don't want to get into that game. But no leader can lead people where they themselves don't have an inclination as to where they want to go. So those divisions were already there. By the time the 50s arose, there was a consciousness of group, and there was a consciousness of group on the threat. So I'll conclude with this line, that while culture and all of that is important, it's what the culture is to be used for. And every leader under a democratic system will use the cultural affinity to mobilize for political power. The question then has to be, what should that power be used for? And unless we can accept in Guyana, as I wrote in my last article, that we must have an equitable distribution to the national patrimony, nobody having any greater legitimacy to anything, meaning we must stress civic nationalism, that we are all equal in what Guyana has to offer. We are going to go through the same thing again and again and again.
We just have a few minutes left. I wonder if the rest of the panelists can just take a minute each and summarize, make final comments, and then we close off. Kimani?
Kimani,
not hearing you.
Are you hearing me now?
No, yes, please, go ahead.
Yeah, I was saying thank you, Dr. Bisram. There are a number of things that I would have wanted to discuss further, but my closing point would be that there was no single tendency alive in Guyana at any one point in time. And I'm addressing this comment to Ravi and Beto. The African Guyanese who were enthusiastic, for example, about Sarawaj, Indian independence. They were Indian Guyanese who welcomed the independence of Ghana, because these were people who were not one-dimensional. They weren't looking at themselves only as Indians and excluding other people. And I think that our discussions have got to bring in those maybe minor tendencies, but they were there. And I think it's an important thing to be able to do, but we don't have the time. Yeah. So I am there.
Professor Ramarak?
Well, I would just say that, based on the discussion we had here today, I think one of the things I would like to see is a sort of, a group that evolves, especially among Indians, who can share or certain basic understanding in this whole paradigm of, Indian existence in Guyana. And I think once we have achieved that level, and this is where I think, Africans have been much more advanced in articulating and understanding who they are as people in the Caribbean. And I think if we can get to that point, where Indians, can articulate their position, and of course, with an understanding of the politics of the societies we live in, I think we can begin to have a much more serious discussion, and an understanding that, hey, we come from different, cultural background, but we're all of the same nationality, and we should, in a sense, have these discussions to promote this, this oneness, or this one Guyana that we all, have the promise of hope for, right? And I think that's where I would hope that this kind of discussion would go. But I think unless we have that level playing field, as I say, where that understanding exists, so we're not, in a sense, knocking down the other side or trying to score a bragging point, but genuinely expressing freely our own opinion about where we stand and how we feel about one Guyana and as a group. Because as I said before, group identity in Guyana has also been the basis for antagonism from both sides, and we still live in a society where, that level of antagonism, I think to a certain extent, it probably is worse today, coming from some quarters. And I think if we can get to that level where we can have that one-to-one discussion, but with a strong understanding of our cultural background and who we are, then I think that will push the discussion forward.
Vincent, you want to close it up for us?
I would wish to say that one should recognize that very often in society, persons who assume leadership are being responsive and giving focus to what's occurring anyhow. They aren't necessarily the originators of these things. They very often recognize, intellectualize, and give leadership, but these things are occurring. So, for example, when those women got together to buy notebook, I don't know that they were all of the same ethnicity, so to speak, but they came together and they bought notebook. So that they are natural processes which the environment can often facilitate, that can move society forward, and in so doing, at different paces, depending on the intellectual intellectual interventions, etc., can move society in a particular direction, which can result, in fact, in fusion that does not deny our diverse origins.
Well, could I have my last 2 cents worth there, Mr. Fisher?
Okay.
Well, first of all, I want to say a belated happy birthday to a very important lady in my village of Iflat. Her name is Mrs. Somra. She came as a 2-year-old from Barbados, Blackstone Plantation in Barbados, via Panama. She was one of those who then lived in Iflat in the Bajan quarters. And last week, she was 100 years old. Before I left for New York for some medical reasons, I asked her blessings and she gave me her blessings. Unfortunately, I'd promised to be there for her birthday and I have not been. So I want to have those members of Iflat who listen to our program, I do know there are some, to convey my wishes to Mrs. Somra, and may she live to be another 100 years old. And yes, Vince, Kimani, in 1958, coming home from primary school, through that section of my village I had to pass through to get to school, I participated in Iflat's first Ghana Republic Independence Day in 1958, March 6th. Thank you.
Well, thank you all, gentlemen. Ravi will have the final word. Good night, all. Thank you for joining us tonight in this very, very important conversation, as Kimani put it, on identity and nationalism in Guyana. Thank